When was the last time you used the word transfiguration in a casual conversation? When was the last time you used transfiguration at all? Transfiguration doesn't enter into our vocabulary very often. It's a church word. The only time we use it is the last Sunday of Epiphany, which is known as Transfiguration Sunday. And on this Sunday, we hear the story of Jesus, Peter, John, and James, who go on a prayer retreat. And while Jesus was praying, Matthew tells us that Jesus' face shone like the sun, and his clothes became dazzling white. Then out of nowhere, Moses and Elijah appear, and they begin a conversation with Jesus. And Peter, who is the master of understatement, says, "Lord, it is good for us to be here." Notice he doesn't say, "Wow, this is the most incredible thing I've ever seen in my life," or at least, "What the heck is going on here?" Instead, he simply says, "Lord, it is good for us to be here." I don't know why I find that humorous, but I do. Then Peter suggests that they build a memorial to commemorate the event, turning the place into a holy shrine. But this was not meant to be. While Peter continued to babble on, a bright cloud enveloped them, which is code language for the glory of God. It's a small portion of God, as much as a human being can handle, basically, without being vaporized on the spot. So instead of getting all of God, you just get God's glory, like a pinch of God. It was there that they heard God's voice saying, "This is my Son, the beloved. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him." Where have we heard that before? Why, it was earlier in the season of Epiphany when Jesus was baptized in the Jordan River. Matthew tells us that as Jesus came up out of the water, suddenly the heavens were opened to him, and he saw the Spirit of God descending like a dove and alighting on him. And a voice from heaven said, "This is my Son, the beloved, with whom I am well pleased." And on that Sunday, those of us who were here at Abiding Savior went to the font to remember our baptisms. And we received a name tag with the word beloved on it to remind us that all of us are God's beloved too. So in our gospel lesson, when the disciples hear the voice of God calling Jesus beloved, they fell to the ground and were overcome by fear, a natural response. Then Jesus reassures them, saying, "Get up and do not be afraid." And when the disciples looked up, they saw no one except Jesus. And as they were coming down the mountain, Jesus warns them, "Tell no one about the vision." As if that was really going to happen, right? I cannot imagine keeping my mouth shut after experiencing an event like this, and I'm sure the disciples didn't either, especially Peter, who often said things in an uncensored and unfiltered way. So how do we make sense of this otherworldly story? What significance does it have for us now as modern Christians? Well, the key to understanding this passage lies in the word transfiguration, which appears in both Matthew and Mark's version of the story. The Greek word for transfiguration is metamorpho, and the gospel writer this is the basis for our English word metamorphosis. So the gospel writers are telling us that the change in Jesus' face was so dramatic, it was as if a metamorphosis had taken place. And this same kind of change of face is also recorded in the book of Exodus in the 34th chapter. It says that Moses came down from Mount Sinai. This was after he received the Ten Commandments. Moses came down from Mount Sinai, and as he came down from the mountain with the 2 tablets of the covenant in his hand, Moses did not know that the skin of his face shone because he had been talking with God. And when Aaron and all the Israelites saw Moses, the skin of his face was shining, and they were afraid to come near him. When Jesus and Moses spent time with God, a powerful change came over them, and it was clearly seen in their faces. But if you think that transfiguration is only for the big guys like Jesus and Moses, then think again. Romans 12 tells us, "I appeal to you, my beloved, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as living sacrifices, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed, metamorpho, by the renewing of your minds, so that you may discern what is the will of God. And again, we see the same thing in 2 Corinthians 3. Now the Lord is Spirit, and where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. And all of us with unveiled faces, seeing the glory of the Lord, again, there's that little portion of God, as though reflected in a mirror, are being transformed, metamorpho, into the same image, from one degree of glory to another. For this comes from the Lord, the Spirit. So we can see that in the New Testament, transfiguration is supposed to happen in our lives as well. And what these passages seem to be telling us is that when we spend quality time with God in prayer and in worship, it changes us. It transforms or transfigures us. We are not the same people we were before God started working in our lives. We are being changed from the inside out, and this change shows in our faces as well as in the way we live our lives. Therefore, transfiguration is something that's supposed to happen to you and me. God desires that we do change, that we become more and more like Jesus. Yes, we are still imperfect beings. We do things that disappoint God and others time and time again. However, because we spend time with God on the mountaintop as well as in the valleys of life, it has an effect on our person. It has an effect on our spirit, and the world around us will notice the difference. We are a changed people because God is at work in our lives. And if we are not a changed people, this should tell us that we need to examine our hearts and see why this is the case. Well, reflecting on this subject of being transfigured, I came up with 4 basic reasons why we are unable to do so, and I'd like to explore them in the remainder of our time together. The first reason why we cannot be transfigured is we are wounded people. A wounded animal tends to hide from others, and when we are wounded, we tend to hide our wounds from God and from others. We cannot be transfigured until we are willing to expose those wounds and look at the parts of ourselves we don't like. We cannot be transfigured until we have the faith that God can heal our woundedness and help us to become more like Jesus. Our wounds prevent us from being transformed. So let's have the courage to give our wounds over to Jesus so that he can heal us and transfigure us. The second reason why we have a hard time being transfigured is we're just too tired. Stress, fatigue, burnout are the byproduct of a busy life and also of a pandemic. And we've all been there, and some of us are still too tired. Sometimes our bodies are so worn out that we don't have the energy to hear what God has to say to us. My favorite story of this is Elijah in 1 Kings 19. It says that Elijah went a day's journey into the wilderness, and he came and sat down under a solitary broom tree, and he asked that he might die. He says, "It's enough now, O Lord. Take away my life, for I am no better than my ancestors." In other words, he's like, "Beam me up, God. I've had enough." And then Elijah lays down under a broom tree and he falls asleep. Suddenly an angel touches him and says, "Get up and eat." And he looks, and there at his head was a cake baked on hot stones and a jar of water. And he ate and drank, and he fell asleep again. And then the angel of the Lord came a second time and touched him and said the same thing, and he got up and ate and drank. And then the writer of 1 Kings says that Elijah went in the strength of that food for 40 days and 40 nights. That's a long time, to Horeb, the Mount of God. This beautiful story just reminds us that sometimes we need to rest and recharge our batteries before God can begin speaking to us and working in us. We cannot be transfigured until our bodies are rested enough to enter into the process of change and reform. The third reason why we have a hard time being transfigured is we are surrounded by too much noise. In our information-saturated age, we are simply overwhelmed by facts, figures, and images. Noise is all around us, and there are few places we can go for silence and solitude. As the Elijah story continues in 1 Kings 19, we hear God tell Elijah, "Go out and stand on the mountain before the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by." And then there was a great wind, but God wasn't in the wind. And then there was an earthquake, but God was not in the earthquake. And then there was fire, but God was not in the fire. And finally, there was the sound of sheer silence. And when Elijah heard it, I think it kind of freaked him out. He wrapped his face in his cloak, and he went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. And in the midst of this sheer silence, God spoke and simply said, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" If we desire to be transfigured by God, we need to have times of silence in our lives. We need to find a place apart from the demands that are placed upon us so that we can hear the still small voice of God. And finally, the fourth reason why we fail to be transformed is that we are just too stubborn to change. It's true. We are wounded, we are tired, we are surrounded by noise. However, the major obstacle in being transformed is that we're used to all this. It's comfortable, it's familiar, and we don't like change because it simply takes too much effort. If we are going to be transfigured by God, it means we must be open to the process of change. And change is difficult. It demands a lot from us. However, change and transformation go hand in hand, and we cannot have one without the other. And so, my beloved friends, if we are going to be transformed, it means we need to be open to the process of change. We need to be willing to let go of old familiar habits and ways of doing things. We need to be willing to explore new territory and try things we've never done before. Transfiguration demands us to be open to the Spirit's leading, even when we aren't quite sure where the Spirit is leading us. And this is sometimes a difficult thing to do. In closing, I'd like to leave you with one last story that illustrates how powerful transfiguration can be in our lives. In Genesis 33, we find the tale of Jacob and Esau. And in this story, Jacob is going back home to reconcile his relationship with Esau, whom he had cheated out of everything. And Jacob sort of sends presents to Esau before he gets there as a way of trying to make some peace. And when he finally meets up with Esau, of course, he expects the worst. He expects that Esau will call for revenge, but instead he discovers grace, and his relationship with Esau is wonderfully reconciled. And during this encounter, Jacob says the following. He says, "If I find favor with you, then accept my present from my hand. For truly to see your face is like seeing the face of God, since you have received me with such favor." Let us be open to the process of transfiguration in our lives so that others may say of us that seeing our face is like seeing the face of God. Amen.